Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I want to introduce you to yet another lovely episode of the Public Comment Podcast. This is a podcast about politics and philosophy for critical, creative, and introspective thinkers. And I want to continue my conversation on ethics and political activism. I was talking to you specifically about how to get to a conversation about political activism. It requires quite a bit of thinking about ethics because you have to understand the case for why politics matters. You want to decide if politics matters. That's a thought to have. And so I was going on to you about thinking about philosophy more broadly and how I think that there's sort of a lack of it in our society, at least in terms of basic education in the field. And so naturally, it would seem to be logical to say that it would follow that ethical and political thinking probably isn't where it should be, and it certainly isn't where it could be. With a little bit more fine-tuning in our approach to these topics. That was sort of the abstract aspect of it. And I try to keep these... who knows how long a podcast should go, or could go, or might go. I haven't decided. I tried to have the cutoff. I actually don't remember anymore, but probably at just short of an hour. Seems fair. I don't like to take up too much of people's time, but I do like to have something interesting that's also not too short. Something you can have in the background doing what it is you like to do or need to do. Drive to a particular place, work. I don't know if you're on the train, if you're a city person in New York, or if you're cleaning around, you're doing your exercise, taking a walk, or just chillin'. I don't know, do people still say chillin'? Anyway, the first thing I want to say as I continue on this topic, really it's even more specifically political activism is really the topic on my mind, but I think that you have to get to I think that you have to get to a conversation on ethics to get there. But I want to look at things, I want to start from a different angle today and tell you another facet of my life. Remember, part of this podcast series and the whole public comment concept is to allow for a real introspective aspect to the philosophical and political conversation. One of the new treats of being an official home owner, as we are, now Ashley and I, as opposed to renters, is that we take on more responsibilities. And that means, as we're looking at our appliances and things like our air condition, no longer is it as simple as calling the manager who takes care of the apartment complex where we used to live in East Windsor. Now it's actually a matter of dealing directly with insurance companies and appliance repair companies and our bank accounts and things of that nature. And one thought that had me thinking, I promise you this ultimately comes back to politics. Your day can never be exactly what you want it to be, can it? Thinking about how the way I like to have my day go, the way I like to have my morning go. There's the ideal, which is a couple hours of reading, fractal reading, with a lot of concentration perhaps on the news and a little bit of philosophy reading. Those are the two most important kinds of reading I'd like to do. Though there's also, if you want to, quote, make it in the world of media as an independent entity, and if you're really independent, then you've got to do all of your own marketing, anyway. It's always healthy anyway to be thinking about the business aspects of things. So just as much as there's conversation and reading to be done on philosophy and politics, so too on things relating to business, economy, marketing, finance, all of those things. And then, so you have these things that you want to do in your morning for your day. And this is before, it depends on who you are. Like if you're me, then the goal is actually for this to be your full-time gig as opposed to a side hustle. And I would, in that context, probably have a lot more time to do a lot more things. But I hope you don't hear that noise in the background as we're in the outside of the studio. There is an event going on. The former owner of the property did stop by. Where was I going with that? Right, going about your ideal day. The context. Context. I swear, if there's one word you're going to hear from me a lot, if it's one of my major motifs, is absolutely context. And I don't mean context in so much of a extreme to say that I am a subjectivist. I don't mean that context means we need to strip ourselves of looking at facts and saying that there are no such thing as universals, to get abstract, if you will. But the context means you need to look at the details, the nuanced details of each sort of little aspect of every little case in life that we're contemplating. So, that being the case, talking about how I want to go about my day. And I may have the things that I want to do in the day, but then let's say I need to take care of my air condition unit. And I need to have someone come on over and take a look at it and tell me how much it's going to cost my wife and I to fix it because it is damaged. Well, that's going to take time out of your day. And so you need to think about how that's going to... So you've got to be flexible in life, I understand. And that's just something I've not been actually good at. That is to say, I'm one of those people who has always considered life navigation and, philosophy and those kinds of things has always been more or less quite cerebral for me. Heady, other people might call it. Overly intellectual, abstract, blah, 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 those kinds of things. But the one thing that I'm teaching myself to be more conscious of as of late is the practical aspects of things, being very practical or pragmatic. One of my old professors and a gentleman I consider quite the mentor, Dr. Leonard Winagora, wanted me to take a look at thinking about philosophy in a more pragmatic light and think about what we might glean from pragmatic philosophy. And I do think there is something to that, in the sense that it's one thing to be thinking, sort of sitting in a corner all day, contemplating the question of what is universal. It's another thing to deal with the reality of our individual nuanced circumstances, such as dealing with my particular air condition unit from in the morning time, based on the companies dealing with me, the air condition repair companies who propose quotes, and the insurance company and what they're willing to cough up, if anything at all. Right. So, it is my thought that really meaningful philosophy, at the end of the day, I think does need to account for how we think about these more practical, pragmatic aspects of actual hands-on, beyond the textbook, beyond the ivory tower aspects of life. what does this have to do with political activism, you might be asking? There are a few different angles we could actually take, that we could go down with respect to that. But I would say the first and foremost important thing for me is the struggle to grapple with the question of political awareness and consciousness. Political awareness and consciousness. As well, by the way, of understanding ethical questions pertaining to political awareness and consciousness. So where do we go from there? How do we build on that kind of contemplation? This isn't the kind of forum where my goal is to give any kind of lecture, so I don't want you to have any thought that that's what's going on here. But let's ask ourselves a few questions, if we may. So you live in this life, and perhaps it would go one way if we didn't live with other people. But we do, and I suppose you could have these sort of metaphysical questions about whether or not this is really real, what you're experiencing. I don't know. That's not something that I relate to, but I understand that is a philosophical point of view some people have. And even if it's not, there's a lot of nihilism out there. And I know, I've talked to you at length about nihilism because I've been through nihilism, and I know how nihilism destroys one's life. How a nihilistic way of thinking that things are utterly meaningless, how this can therefore lead you to not really treat your relationships and those around you with the utmost love. How it can lead you to not even really care all that much about your environment. There's a series of podcasts I've been working on about the topic of moving someplace better. And what that means, I was telling you about how I moved to South Beach at one point in my life, and how this was a nihilistic point in my life, and I just didn't really all that much care about anything, really, other than some weird fatalistic, sort of narcissistic almost views of so-called romantic love that I had at the time, and how that did damage to the romantic relationship I had at the time. Now, I hadn't finished telling you all of that because that is an overly complex situation, and you can certainly check out the older podcast episodes to hear a little bit more about that. My point being, though, is one of the first questions we have to ask is the degree to which we care about the way we I apologize about that. The degree which we care about ourselves, and the degree to which we care about the world around us and the people around us. And why we do or why we don't. Those are conversations we really have to have, and we really have to have them more so than I think it seems. When you ask yourself, how many people, for example, actually are really all that aware of, for lack of better terms, the world around them? I could tell you for a very long time I was not aware of the world around me. And I told you before, this will be another one. I have a lot of motifs. And one of them is the fact that I just, for so long, didn't care. It took me until I was 25 years old to actually start paying attention to the world around me. Prior to that, I was utterly oblivious. There were a few exceptions. I was opposed to the war in Iraq, I believe, as a teenager when that went around. And it bothered me that people were unfriendly towards the LGBT community when I was a teenager. Those were the two things I remember being vocal about. But, I mean, I certainly had no concept of politics. And, you know, it's... What do we think about even when we hear the word politics? Because one of my fears is that when we think about it, we go sort of immediately to this ethos of feeling jaded. That all politicians are inherently corrupt or are just corrupt these days, and it's all a sort of useless thing to wrap your mind around. That's certainly one way of looking at it. When I first ran for political office back in 2013 and I was knocking on doors, one of the things that came abundant was there were a number of people who felt that it was meaningless and inconsequential to really engage in a conversation with me because it wasn't going to translate to anything that they could believe in. That's something I think the society is starting to wrap its mind about a little bit more. I told you my wife and I, we've been watching Designated Survivor. Disappointed that we finished all the episodes. Want to see more. But it really taps into this idea of people seeking independent-minded politicians as opposed to people who answer only to money and the lust for re-election and megalomania and things like that. But let's look even broader and deeper and go beyond that, if we may. And what do we have? And I think the whole point there is the conversation must start, again, dealing with the fact that we are in a world with other people and that we have to start then asking, how do we find a way to deal with each other? And I don't mean that in a dark way, but what I mean by that is we have to have some kind of social organization and think about what it means to live in a society, in a group of people where... I mean, I'm trying to think almost more beyond immediate society as it is today, and really trying to think about this really abstractly. I'm not sure which is the more helpful approach. But if you just think about it in the world today, we know how, maybe that's better. We know that everything we do is so consequential. Even if you're nihilistic, there is a sense of what you do, how we affect each other. I mean, we've had this conversation, but there's the money thing. I mean, by saying we've had this conversation, like if you look at my blog and you look at the podcast and things, you know that I have been going on about this quite a bit. It's a topic that matters a lot to me. But there is the fact that if you want something in life and you want something from somebody else, you have to deal with that person. And it's often a financial transaction. Not necessarily, but it's often a financial transaction. There's questions of, are there things that nobody should be allowed to do? If you ever think socially, I mean, you have, if you care at all about your own life, forget about questions of altruism or compassion. If you have any sort of egoistic or self-preserving impulse, then the rational thought is, what kind of social rules could or should exist so that I can live okay? And that's when we get into what I think is probably the more fundamental question, is that of rights, and the question of what should a person therefore not be allowed to do. and what should a person absolutely be allowed to do, and why or why not, and how would we go about then enforcing that, right? And there we start thinking about government. Tying this back, though, to the conversation I had about the fact that it's all nice to have that conversation and understand that as an important subject of thought, but what about having to deal with your broken air condition unit and making sure you get the best deal on that? And what about all the cleaning you must do if you want to live someplace you feel good about? And what about making sure all your laundry is done? And what about making sure that you've got the food that you need, and that you're making sure that you're cooking or preparing or getting access to breakfast, lunch, and dinner? And you see that the to-do lists day to day, plus whatever work you must do to make an income, plus whatever transportation you need to make that work out for you. And you see that, this to-do list that we have, each of us has, piles up. Oh, politics? What about that now? I'm tired. I don't want to think about policy and rules right now. That is, unless, on the other hand, and here's where it gets more nuanced, complicated. Think about, let's use medicine as a perspective, health world. You're not feeling good. You need to see a doctor. Where are you going to go? How much is it going to cost? How are you going to cover that cost if it's too much? What are you going to do if you can't? And what if no one around you gives a damn? Because we live in this very libertarian society where they say, oh, just leave it to private charity, but private charity, all the private charities in the world couldn't possibly address everyone's little issue anyway. And then you feel a stake all of a sudden perhaps in the political questions. You ask yourself, is it necessarily fair? Or is it right that I should be left to die while other people who are just in better situations can get, who would have the same health problem as me perhaps, who will have the access to a doctor and access to the right medicine, but I won't, because I was just the wrong place at the wrong time in life. And maybe that person begins to feel a stake in politics. It still remains complicated, because even then, how do you begin to wrap your mind around all of the more nuanced questions about that? It's easy enough for someone to raise their hand and knock on your door and say, oh, I'm for health insurance, or oh, I'm for getting rid of that Obamacare thing. Those are talking points, though, and not real policy and political and philosophical thinking. And so, in terms of, forget for a second then this issue of being a political activist, but again, dealing with even the question of political awareness and what it requires in life to be in a position where you can be politically aware. What it means to actually be politically aware. And the fact that even if you are passionate about politics, and that's your go-to subject in life, it's still not super easy to have as much awareness as you perhaps would like. I will tell you, as someone who I majored, my college background was in liberal studies, but my concentrations were in politics and history. History being mostly about politics, I would say I'm decently educated in politics. Plus I ran for political office for 3 years, and most of my free time I spent in life, really thinking as much as I could about politics, reading, researching, and being an activist, etc. Point being that politics does play a major role in my life, but I'm still not at a place where I feel like I have a political awareness that I feel as good about, perhaps, as I could. Because other complexities in my day-to-day life arise. Like I said, I had to deal with insurance questions today, and my broken air condition unit. And you have to think also about not just quote unquote dealing with it, like calling someone and having them fix it, or how am I going to finance it. You have to ask yourself, am I going to get the best deal? You have to analyze the diagnosis of the problem and the proposals of how to fix it that the air condition people who come and take a look, that they tell you is the problem. Are they being 100% honest? Do they assume you perhaps don't know as much about how air condition units and furnaces and HVAC systems and all of those things work? Are they assuming they know more about how all of that works than you do? And are they willing to take advantage of that because it makes them and their company more money? And here we get into the ethical question then. Again, to what extent is that something they concern themselves with ethically? And to what extent is the company leadership they work with concerned about ethical aspects of that? And how do you protect yourself against all of that? So, I was telling you that there's an in-the-head approach to philosophical thinking one could take versus of a more hands-on. I could have spent this morning saying F it and reading my Foreign Affairs magazine and not caring because of the thought that that would not help me become a better political thinker. Of course, that wouldn't be true, but you see how easy it is to fall into these traps, either from an intellectual point of view or from a sort of consumer point of view, whether or not you are someone who cares about politics or not. Again, I don't even believe we've touched yet on thinking about political activism, because we're still thinking about political awareness and what it takes to be politically aware. So maybe you say, fine, it probably does make sense to have some notion of what's going on in the world, so I'll have the news on in the background. But of course you've got to vet the news, right? Especially these days, we're so much more inundated with the reality of biases and questions of fake news. And even it would have been one thing back in 2015, 2016 when President Obama was still president. But now with President Trump, who is a pathological liar, perhaps surpassing any president we've ever had. I mean, I would actually be interested. Does anyone have any information on a president who has lied more and at a faster rate than other presidents we've had? Because I think most of us accept that politicians naturally or often, shall we say, don't always tell the exact truth, or will say one thing and end up doing something a little different. We all do that anyway. That's a human thing. I'm not saying we all lie, but what I am saying is what seemed to be the case yesterday is not always the case tomorrow. And so politicians are as inclined to be part of that metaphysical reality as any of us. Just last week, I thought that the video blog medium might be the end-all for me. Now I'm thinking less about an end-all, but more about my interest in the podcast as certainly a medium that's probably more conducive to a large portion of my media project ideas. Because day to day, we think more, hopefully, and realize something a little different, something a little new perhaps, that gives us a clearer idea than we had the day before. That's why I like to call myself a clarificationist. That's why I like to call myself a practical clarificationist, because I believe those are the two sort of most pertinent words to philosophical thinking, as I understand it today anyway. That could change, but and I relate that to a sort of pragmatist way of thinking, a sort of branch off, if you will, or sort of relative of basic pragmatism. And so my point being, I did digress a little bit, my point being that it's not even enough to have the TV on in the background if you want to be politically aware, really, because you have to hold politicians account for what they say. And it's one thing that they will naturally sometimes just say ends up changing their minds about things for a variety of reasons. Again, sometimes it's really because we just start learning new facts that put us in a position where we have to reframe the way we think about something. Other times there are political reasons for why a politician will say one thing and say something else later. We know in President Obama's case, one of the big ones was you can keep your doctor, you can keep your current healthcare plan. And that turned out not to be true. So even from my perspective, even the politicians that we feel better about, even somewhat nostalgic about perhaps, they're not perfect. So you have to pay attention to what you hear on the news. It's not enough to just hear in the background. It's not just enough to watch it, Fox or MSNBC. You have to do a little bit of homework if you care about politics, if you want to engage in politics. And you should, I believe. But the question is how to pull that off. And how to do it in a way that you can feel good about. And that's not so easy to answer. One of the things that's always frustrated me, beyond all those things I just told you, is the fact that you just scratch the surface even if you begin doing your homework on one topic, even if it's just local politics. Local politics in itself is highly complex and a daunting world to navigate around. Especially if you live somewhere like, where I used to live in East Windsor, where it was actually an extraordinarily corrupt situation, where basically the town council gets away with breaking the law. They blatantly break the law with things like, for example, statutory requirements from the state to make town council meeting minutes available. They just don't. I did about a year and a half ago now, I guess, call the state attorney general's office in New Jersey to let them know. And when I told the town council and the township manager that I was doing this, it scared them into publishing a few of the town council meeting minutes. But then that was that. Once I stopped bothering them, they stopped making them available. My point being that you've got a lot to deal with these local political entities just to keep them in compliance with laws. And to an extent, they probably know, especially in particular communities like East Windsor, where they're used to people not caring. It's probably easy enough for them to get rather negligent and cocky about the extent to which they believe they even need to worry about the complexities of the law that they're subject to. And it gets more complicated when you go to town council meetings and you get interrupted, you get disrespected, disregarded. In my case, I was technically prevented from speaking for no reason whatsoever. And I had to literally yell over the mayor just so that it could be on the record, in the minutes, in theory, that I had something to say during the public comment period of a town council meeting. But she refused to, she kept on saying that the public comment period was closed anyway. And so you have to ask yourself, as a human being, how many people with the daily stresses that they have have the means to wrap their minds around all of that. And I don't mean in terms of competence or intellectual capacity or even psychological strength. I mean, to what extent is it rational that a person is able to do all of that? And then concern themselves with all the other realms of politics. The bottom line then is, we just live in actually a complicated world. I don't know that it's actually more complicated than it's ever been. Actually, technology has perhaps enabled us to simplify in a lot of ways. But it's still complicated, and I do think that with all the technology and the flood of media and social media and greater access to it, I do think there is a certain increase in complexity or perception of an increase in life complexity. So you feel you're inundated with a lot of information. I talk about it all the time, information overload. And it's, in my opinion, it is easy to feel overwhelmed day to day. And it is probably rational to assume that you will. Just because of what our culture is like, not even beginning to count the more political aspects of it. And this isn't even getting to a point of really what it means, in my opinion, to necessarily be an activist. But this still leads to the question of, should I? And why? To what degree is it even possible, really, to be a political activist in today's world? How much of a specialized service does it, in fact, have to end up being? And how much can you even depend on that? And say that you're someone who cares about, I don't know, having some kind of association with a political activist organization that will keep you informed, that you're willing to donate money to, or I don't know, whatever. It is damn complicated. And frustrating. And to a degree, how much can we simplify it or expect that it could be simplified in the near future? And that's why, one reason why, for me, one of the important things is to ask myself, as opposed to trying to be a quote-unquote expert on all things politics, to try and ask and really contemplate how we get at a sense of priorities with respect to the big political picture in our world today, in our society. That's something that helps me. Vision and agenda making, I guess you could call it. I write that down, I like that point. And, I mean, to that end, when we start talking in terms of political priorities, I actually do think it becomes easier. Definitely. And therefore, from a practical perspective, makes things a lot easier for me. One mistake I was making And I'm still figuring out how to like ultimately fix or adapt and improve my protocol, if you will, for remaining as politically informed as I can reasonably expect of myself. Still tweaking exactly how I want to go about that. But the mistake I was making was I was almost indiscriminately just flooding my brain with news articles and analyzing them as much as I could for about 2 hours a day, 3 hours a day, and feeling that was okay. The problem with that, as I come to think of it, first of all, you go into your New York Times or your Washington Post, and there are so many articles, and they're the ones choosing what they consider to be the most important article and the most timely article. You can't possibly get through it all. So, that's sort of an irony, too, isn't it? They publish all of these articles and produce all of this content. How many people in the world actually go through an entire currently available slew of articles and content made available each day? First of all, you'd have to have a lot of time. And that's just to consume it. To actually be able to process it and analyze it. It's not reasonable to assume anybody with a rational mind could or would. So, with respect to what it means, just again, forget going to the more activistic aspect of political activism. Just awareness is such a complex task. And so, my thought is it can't be just inundating yourself with news articles isn't going to do it. Though you do want to obviously probably scan them. That's what I do, at least do news scans. And I think at that point, that's when you sort of ask what you need to prioritize and how does that correspond to the way you've been prioritizing thus far? And how do you determine what your priorities are some key questions that are absolutely worth having. In my case, I know that there are questions now about Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. I understand that that's going to be heard by the appellate court today, federal appellate court, and that the Affordable Care Act could be struck down. And this is a mind-blowing concern. I've told you that I have a sort of agenda. I have a sense of priorities and vision, notion of policies that I consider most important in dealing with. And I may have said yes, I don't remember when I may have last said it, but I probably told you that I consider twin priorities addressing our healthcare concerns and addressing the criminality of our current commander-in-chief, President Trump. Two things that need to be done. And then there's a conversation about angle. Then there's the conversation about, well, what can I do about these things? Then there's a conversation about how do I inform myself about these particular things? And how do I fit that into my daily schedule? All very good questions. And I told you before, too, that gosh, there are just other things, too, that one wants to do. I like to read my Montaigne as much as I can. I like to watch my Rachel Maddow and my Lawrence O'Donnell. I want to learn more about art. There's so many things that I want to do in life and not enough time in the day. Damn, that is a conflict. That is a conflict. I guess one thing that is sort of like a silver lining, I think it is a great motivation to desire a long life, so that you can get as much, you know that there's just so much to live for. That is true. There is so much to live for. That's one silver lining of it. And there we go again, understanding the importance of being caring about politics. And it comes back to healthcare. I want my fellow people to live as long as they can. Now, I understand that one of the complexities of American politics especially is that it's not yet a entirely agreed upon or widely agreed upon thing that basic health care should be something that all people have. And so one of the things that I feel motivated to do, and I guess this is a question we can all ask, where do I fit in the grand scheme of where each person can play some kind of role in being an activist to some degree, in some way, shape, or form? For me, part of it, I think, is understanding an intellectual case for something. As someone, again, who's very philosophically minded, it would seem reasonable to me that I do what I can to address the philosophical questions and to make that available to as many people as I can to share those thoughts. That's one way I conceptualize what I might be able to do in life. And so I do wrap my mind a lot around the ethics concerning how we should be thinking about healthcare, health insurance in the United States. And again, I go to that question of, given a circumstance where someone does not have access to healthcare, ethically, what are you to do about it? And there is a libertarian crowd among us, and a sort of conservative, libertarian-ish crowd among us who believe you do nothing. That it is not your responsibility, it is not your ethical mandate to give a damn about anybody else other than those you want to give a damn about, because it is somehow in your self-interest. Whether in a really callous way or in a sort of Ayn Rand way where she might say, well, you value this individual, and because you value that particular individual, you may help that individual, but you don't feel that you owe everybody. So you don't feel bound, let's say, to pay taxes and provide through your income, let's say, for the health care of every person in the country, let's say. But I would like to raise a question that I think is important to have, and I will preface this question with this. Though some people have criticized me in the past for being overly semantical in my thinking, semantical, which is the right word, speaking of, in that I do get hung up on words, because I think words are important. I don't usually use the expression healthcare is a right. Not because I don't want to provide healthcare for everybody, because I believe as a policy, every person on earth should have access to healthcare, and that should be a fundamental political concern for every government. But I don't like using the word right, because I think that there's actually something stronger. I think there are stronger ways to articulate the case for a universal healthcare conversation. And to me, it begins with the question of asking, it begins by delving into the ethics of compassion and the things sort of surrounding that. And the way I begin that is this: what does it mean to acknowledge the fact that there are people who will not receive the health care they need and die? What does that mean? To me, the very obvious meaning is that to not care, to be aware of it and not care, would appear to me callous. Would appear to be an actual act of cruelty, and by virtue of that attitude, actually contribute to that person's death and harm. And I argue that to not care is an act of cruelty, and it's a sort of something between negligence and belligerence, and I don't think those are ethical things. I really don't. And intellectually, then, there is this conversation of how does that reconcile with, let's say, starting from an egoist, libertarian sort of perspective, where all that matters is my issues, or at least it's not, there's no moral mandate for me to have to sacrifice any aspect of my life for other people. It raises this whole question of what is a moral mandate, or like how do we determine an ought, or how do we determine an ethical principle? How do we say this is the fact that compels us to confine our interests merely to ourselves, or to compel us to take an interest in our wider community and in a legal, political context or otherwise? I think I may have said this in I do have these two vlogs. I think it would be appropriate perhaps to make them available in podcast form too, but I do have two videos explaining my evolution from a more libertarian point of view to a liberal, what I call social democratic point of view. So you can probably get more vivid detail from that. Perhaps I'll make that link available to you. But to me, the irony is that, in fact, if you have a sort of egoistic perspective, suppose you want to entertain an egoistic perspective, or think about all of the different ways egoism could theoretically be interpreted. Because that means, taking self-interest, self-concern. What does it actually mean to have concern for yourself? Because what does it mean to thrive? What does it mean to do well? What does it mean to care for yourself? What do those things actually mean? And why do we say so? You could argue that it doesn't make any sense for any of your resources to be allocated to the people around you. But I would argue to the contrary. Ironically, it would actually seem to be in a person's self-interest to live in a community around people who feel better, feel well and are doing well, as opposed to living in a society around people who are miserable and doing very not well. Just logically, forget the whatever empirical statistics actually exist. Pure logic would have to suggest that if you live amongst a crowd of disgruntled people, really tired people who feel underappreciated and underpaid and severely anxious about it all, a pure logic suggests that, in fact, you might see some crime, you might see some bitterness, you might see some drug abuse, you might see really bad relations, and you might see a sort of all-out problematic ethos stirring up against the few who have so much and aren't sharing. And that means that in two different ways, just based on, I think, that logical consideration, it would seem there are actually two different ways you could think about that. You could think about that from a very sort of detached and pure pragmatic point of view, and just say, you know, if you want to deal with like constant rebellion all the time and constant anger all the time, maybe, and again, this is not my perspective, but it's a perspective you could have. If you just want to shut the damn poor, angry people up, maybe cough up more subsidies for them or something like that, right? That's one really awful way to look at it. It's not my way, but that is one way in which you could argue that, in fact, it's in a person's self-interest to care about the world around them in more than a sort of resource hoarding kind of way. I think another way, and this is where I think the word compassion comes in. It's a really good word. I love the word compassion. If you think about what compassion means, part of it is having a sort of sympathy or empathy or concern for your fellow people. I don't think that compassion is the same as altruism. I don't think that compassion is the same thing as saying you must only live for other people, or your interests will never be as important as the interests of other people. Always put others first before yourself. I don't know that compassion has to mean that. Not if you're sort of universal and consistent in your application of compassion as a principle, right? Wouldn't compassion just mean that essentially you're not indifferent to the suffering of others? I think, well, let's get some definitions here so that you know I'm not making up my own definitions, because I don't like to do that, and I don't like when other people do it. It's always a matter of, oh, well, that's your definition, right? Ayn Rand liked to say, I shall define my terms. One of the few things I love about Ayn Rand. The Google dictionary, which I don't trust, says that compassion is sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or misfortunes of others. Similarly, the Merriam-Webster dictionary says sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. That's from Merriam-Webster Dictionary's definition of compassion. Here's Cambridge Dictionary. A strong feeling of sympathy and sadness for other people's suffering or bad luck, and a desire to help. Here's vocabulary.com. I've been chastised and criticized, by the way, for my interest in vocabulary.com as a source, as a dictionary. However, if you doubt me on this, I encourage you to actually take a look at the actual definitions vocabulary.com provides, and I will argue that probably 85% of the time, or something quite like that, their definitions actually tend to be more cut and dry and simpler and more logical than most of the other definitions out there that dictionaries provide. Compassion, says vocabulary.com. If someone shows kindness, caring, and a willingness to help others, they're showing compassion. Put another way, another thing is vocabulary will often put things in a few different ways so that you can really feel the word. I've talked about this before too, but I really do care about words. It is the writer in me, or the verbal person in me. I think that you need to really think about a word and sift through a word, really dive into a word. I fixate over words. Even words that I know what they mean when I'm reading stuff, I'll often circle the word in the book and look up a definition. And I'll often look up more than one dictionary definition, just because you really want to think about the full meaning of that word. And sometimes, even if you consciously know it, just a matter of forcing your brain to expose itself to different ways of wording the explanation for that word, it will resonate with you on a deeper level, and you will probably enhance your understanding and your vocabulary and your eloquence and all that. A deep awareness of and sympathy for others and others' suffering, or the humane quality of understanding the suffering of others and wanting to do something about it. That's my favorite of the definitions we went to so far. This one. The humane quality of understanding the suffering of others and wanting to do something about it. Essentially, it means, put another way, caring that other people suffer to such an extent that you take issue with the fact that they suffer. That's compassion in a nutshell. And you'd have to ask, is there a moral case for compassion? Is there a case for compassion? Why or why not? And I think I've argued a bit about why I think there is that case. Again, whether you have it from a sort of awful and cold, egoistic perspective, whether you have it from a more, in my opinion, logical interpretation of what egoism could be, that is to say, it's actually of the benefit of the individual to care about the well-being of the other individuals around them, and to think about social health, that's actually a logical thing for your own well-being as much as for the well-being of others, then really, whether you go through it altruistically, egoistically, or again, the word I like to use is just compassion, it really does seem like either way you look at it, there is a case to be a basically compassionate human being. Then the question is, how does that translate? And how do we combat the impediments towards making that happen? So that's going to be the end of my conversation today. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to the Public Comment Podcast, the place where we can chat about politics and philosophy for critical, creative, and introspective thinkers. They say that you're supposed to have these taglines or these slogans, and I think it's not such a bad idea because it makes it just really clear what you're getting into. And what I hope that you would feel good about. If you enjoyed today's episode, I hope very much so that you would be inclined to share this on your social media with your friends, family, the people that you associate with. I hope that you'd be willing to click a like wherever you happened to listen to this, and I hope that you'd even offer a comment. Let's join in the conversation together, shall we? And yeah, I guess I will then leave it at that. Thank you so much. Have a fantastic day. I look forward to chatting with you later. Oh yeah, and if you're interested in more from Public Comment, do check out publiccomment.blog. That is publiccomment.blog. Okay then, chat with you later. Bye.